Hello, I'm Dr. David Kenley, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Dakota State University. And for the next few minutes, I'd like to speak with you a little bit about modern Chinese history. My PhD is in Chinese history, and a few years back, wrote a book called Modern Chinese History that was published by the Association for Asian Studies and Columbia University Press. And I realize that it's impossible to cover all of modern Chinese history in just a few moments, but we are going to discuss some major events or turning points, as I like to call them. Before we begin, I invite you to consider a few questions. How do scholars identify turning points in history? What are the turning points in modern China? And what themes transcend such turning points? In other words, if things transcend those turning points, perhaps they're not a significant turn after all. What do I mean by turning point? Well, according to Adrian Pritchard, a turning point in history is more than just an important event that happened a long time ago. It is an idea, event, or action that directly and sometimes indirectly caused change. This change could be social or cultural, affecting a society's way of thinking or way of acting. It could be political, leading to new legislation or to a new government taking charge. It could be economic, affecting how goods are produced, bought, and sold, or how much or how little a society has to spend on such items. A turning point can even cause all of these changes and more. But it isn't always easy to identify turning points when they occur, as it may take years to understand the significance of a historical event. Furthermore, defining significance is itself a qualitative judgment, and doing so reveals much about a person or a society's underlying values and priorities. For all of these reasons, historians frequently argue and disagree on what are history's major turning points. For the next few moments, I would like to talk to you about three potential turning points in modern Chinese history and ask you to reflect on the significance of each. These three turning points include the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, the 1949 Communist Revolution, and the 2001 World Trade Organization, or WTO, revolution. By looking at these three, we should have a better understanding of modern Chinese history as a whole, as we consider both disruptions as well as continuities in modern China. The 1911 Xinhai Revolution brought to an end over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. The Qing dynasty, which ruled from 1644 to 1911, had experienced numerous challenges during the 19th century, each of which weakened the power and influence of the Qing rulers. One of the dynasty's most vocal critics was Sun Yat-sen, who had been educated in Honolulu and Hong Kong and was a staunch admirer of American democracy. Sun's anti-Qing views and activities put him in hot water with the court, and Sun spent much of his adult life living abroad in exile. On October 11th, 1911, Sun's followers in China launched a rebellion against the government, and by the end of that year, they had successfully declared the founding of the Republic of China, bringing an end to 2,000 years of imperial rule. Yuan Shikai, one of the most powerful Qing military generals, agreed to support the fledgling republic only if the revolutionaries would allow him to be the inaugural president. For the next 4 years, Yuan systematically undermined the legislature, outlawed elections, and filled government positions with his political henchmen. Finally, in 1915, he declared himself to be emperor for life. Although Yuan himself died just a few months later, the 4-year-old Republic of China functionally ceased to exist. For the next 30 years, China would be ruled by a patchwork of military warlords, leaving the nation vulnerable to outside attack, as happened with the Japanese invasion of World War II. The 1949 Communist Revolution is the second turning point I want to introduce. Following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Japanese troops withdrew from China. Two organizations emerged with the goal of reunifying China under a centralized regime. The first was the Nationalist Party, under the control of Chiang Kai-shek, the individual seen in this photo on the left. The second was the Communist Party, under the control of Mao Zedong, the individual on the right. By 1949, Mao's forces had gained the upper hand, and on October 1, they declared the founding of the Communist People's Republic of China. The leaders of the People's Republic had lofty political, social, and economic goals. While they claimed to be a democracy, China became a one-party state under communist control with few protected civil liberties. Officials pushed for the elimination of private property, and within the first decade, the majority of the population was living and working on large agricultural communes. Not only did these communes have huge economic impacts, but innumerable social impacts as well. By 1959, it was clear that these communes were failing, and perhaps as many as 20 million individuals starved to death as a result of economic mismanagement and failed agricultural policies. Political leaders quickly began blaming each other, leading to an era of political purges and intra-party squabbles known as the Cultural Revolution, which continued until 1976, when Mao Zedong died. The third and final turning point I want you to consider is what I call the WTO revolution. After the death of Mao in 1976, a series of more pragmatic individuals rose to control the party and the state. Less dogmatic in their commitment to communism, these leaders pushed for greater private property, international trade, and personal entrepreneurship. By 2001, these trends reached a crescendo when China applied for and was admitted to the World Trade Organization, or WTO. The impact on China has been nothing short of astounding. Since 2001, poverty levels have plummeted and food production expanded as China has become one of the largest economic powers in the world. No longer fearful of mass starvation, the Chinese population is now dealing with the problems of developed countries, including, for instance, rising diabetes rates. Communes and small agricultural villages have withered away as peasants have left the countryside and moved to urban centers in search of work in emerging factories and industrial floors. These migration patterns have fundamentally changed extended and nuclear family relationships, perhaps best exemplified by the rapidly declining birth rate. While China remains a one-party state under the control of communist leaders, it is in no ways comparable with China of the pre-WTO era. I invite you to consider for a moment the significance of these three turning points in modern Chinese history. Which, for instance, was most impactful on China and the world? Which might be overrated in terms of its revolutionary change? Are there other turning points you believe belong on this list instead of these three? For instance, Does the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 represent a more significant turning point than these three I have highlighted? To think about it another way, are there enduring themes in modern China that transcend these turning points, making them appear, with a little hindsight, perhaps less significant than some historians would lead you to believe? For example, modern Chinese history has consistently been intertwined with global history, and all three turning points illustrate this fact. Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the 1911 revolution, grew up in Hawaii and modeled his government on the United States. Many of the leaders of the 1949 revolution studied in France, and all were indebted to the ideas of the German philosopher Karl Marx. Post-Mao leaders all vowed to make China a major player in international economics, setting up systems and structures to facilitate foreign investment and foreign trade, culminating in China's ascension to the World Trade Organization in 2001. China's development in the 20th century has mirrored that of other emerging powers. Whether we are analyzing social structures, demography, environment, or economy, China has followed well-known patterns repeatedly seen in world history. International engagement is but one constant element that has continued throughout modern China and makes these turning points appear less transformational than we might otherwise assume. With a critical approach to research, it is possible to identify many enduring themes that persist both before and after history's so-called turning points. As I conclude this segment, I invite you to reflect on these questions as they relate to American society and history. What are America's historical turning points? Can you justify your answers? Just as important, where do we look to identify turning points? Are such turning points largely a function of political change, economic change, social change, or something else altogether? Today, historians, educators, and the public at large continue to debate just what are America's turning points. As we learn to be critical observers, we can better appreciate the contested nature of history writing. At the same time, we can understand our own contemporary values as we look into the past and create structures and frameworks to enhance our understanding.